So last week I mentioned, almost as an aside, that I'd be far more comfortable giving advice to somebody or helping somebody out in an airport than I would parking my RV. And of course the reason for that is I've spent a whole lot more time in airports than I have towing and moving and parking my RV. In fact, when I first graduated from college, my first job required me to travel all the time. I traveled, well over like 40, 45 weeks a year at that point, and I would fly out kind of Sunday night and fly home on Thursday. So I got really comfortable with airports. I got comfortable with airports sort of like pre 9/11. So I flew for about a year before, and then of course after, when things were changing and all the rules were changing. I flew all throughout that time until things kind of settled down and we have the routine that we kind of know of today as the way that we navigate airports. And one of the things that happens if you spend a lot of time in airports is after a while you can find yourself, shall we say, losing grace or patience for those who obviously do not spend a lot of time in airports, and you can find yourself getting frustrated by people who don't seem to know that there are new rules, or that the rules have changed, or there are rules at all about what you can and can't do at an airport, especially at security. And I remember flying once, actually flying with my wife on vacation. I think it was the first time that she had really flown for a while. And so I'm just like, just follow me and do what I do and we'll get through here. And that worked for the most part. And of course, she wasn't necessarily 100% familiar and wasn't, as dedicated and wasn't as kind of single-minded focused as I tended to be about, like, we're going to get through this airport as fast as possible because this is no fun and, we just got to get through it and be efficient. And because it didn't work out quite that way, we actually missed pre-boarding for our flight, which is a nice perk when you've been flying for a while. You get those statuses and they let you do fun things like pre-board. We actually missed pre-boarding, something that I really wasn't all that happy about. In fact, I was rather grumpy. And I think shortly thereafter, my wife looked at me and she's like, I'm not sure I really want to fly with you anymore because you're really no fun. And it was kind of this wake-up moment for me that really I had just been in, like, let's get to the airplane, let's do it as fast as possible. Like, I had a goal in mind and I was focused on that goal, and had missed that we were actually not going to work, we were actually going on vacation, and that the fun could really begin whenever we wanted the fun to begin, including, strangely enough, maybe it could be fun to even be at the airport because we were there together. And how could we not have fun if we were there together and getting ready to go and spend a week on a beach together, which is what we were doing. And I realized that this happens, and it happens to me, I will confess, a lot, where I have a goal, there's something in mind, there's somewhere I want to get to, there's somewhere I want to go, there's something I want to achieve, there's something I want to accomplish, and I can become very, very focused on that thing. So focused, in fact, that sometimes what happens is I can lose sight of what is happening and going on around me. Sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a good thing. That's how we get things done. Sometimes you do just have to put your head down and slog through it and get the task accomplished. Sometimes that is the right thing to do. But sometimes it's not. And it's not because if we do that, if we say so singly-mindedly focused on the goal that we have in front of us, we can miss important things happening around us. We can miss new information coming to us. We can miss opportunities that may arrive along the way that may actually be calling us to a better place, to an even better goal, or things may show up along the way warning us that that thing that we're heading towards, that place that we're heading towards, may not be the place we want to go to after all. This really, in today's story, is Balaam's problem. Now, we're in the book of Numbers, so we're still, we started this looking at Abraham and Genesis, being in Genesis, looking at Abraham's story and his story of being on the road. We've moved forward in a great deal of time, so we're now in the time of Moses. We are the time where God's people have left slavery in Egypt, but are wandering around the Promised Land. They really haven't arrived yet, and they are encountering resistance along the way from other people and other kingdoms, and God is helping them overcome those challenges. And people are starting to notice that there's this whole group of people, because how could you not notice? But people have started to notice there's this whole group of people wandering around, going from place to place, getting in skirmishes with people, and having it turned out, and having them come out of it victorious. God's people in this part of the story are making people very nervous. And they made another king in the area very nervous, to the point that that king decides to call in some help. And he basically calls in to help Balaam, and Balaam, who is not part of God's people, he's not a Jew. What he is a prophet, and he not just kind of a prophet, but he's really like a prophet for hire, right? It's a little, have gun, will travel, kind of thing. And the king comes to him and says, look, the king comes to Balaam and says, I know that if you put a curse on somebody, they will be cursed. And if you put a blessing on somebody, they will be blessed. I want you to come and put a curse on all of these folks that are wandering around and causing all these problems. And Balaam says, well, first I have to ask God, right? Balaam doesn't claim that he has the ability to do this, but he knows that his power comes from somewhere else. And he understands, in his way, he understands that the power that he has to bless or curse comes from God. And what's interesting is, even though he's not part of God's people, even though he is not a Jew, he is the way that the Hebrew word that is used for when Balaam talks about God, he does mean God, as in Lord your God, the God that Moses and all his people are following. So we have this really interesting situation where God is actually working through somebody who is not one of God's people. This is why, and this isn't necessarily the sermon today by any means, but this is why we always have to be careful when we limit who we think God can work through, because God works through some really some very surprising people, and Balaam is one of them. But God works through him, and he knows that, and he prays to God, and God's like, I'm not going to curse these people, those are my people. And so he can't do what the king wants. So he sends word back, says, I can't go with you, I can't do what he wants. Well, the king sends even more people and more riches and gets even more insistent that Balaam do this. And finally, God says, it's okay. If he comes again, you can go with him. And so that's where we join the story now, is Balaam is on the road, because that's what we're doing this summer. We're on a road trip. Balaam's on the road riding on his donkey, and which means he has a donkey to ride. So obviously he's a fairly financially successful prophet for hire because he has a donkey to ride. Most people don't. And he's going to where the king is calling him, and is obviously thinking about other things. All right, so God puts an impediment in his path. He puts this angel in the path, in his way, that Balaam doesn't see. And we get the story that we read today about the donkey noticing this thing that Balaam didn't. And what we can imagine, and we have to read into it a little bit because we're not really told exactly what's going on with Balaam in his mind, but what you can easily imagine, he's very focused on where it is he's going. He's very distracted by it, right? He knows he's going to see the king. He doesn't think he can actually give the king what he wants, which is never a good thing to disappoint a king, especially an angry one who's willing to pay to have somebody curse people, right? I'm sure Balaam's thinking, am I going to end up being the cursed one, right? He gets very distracted. He's very in his own thoughts. He's very in his own head at this moment, and somehow misses the giant angel with a sword in front of him, and so he gets in an altercation with his donkey. He is so goal-focused in that moment, he doesn't really even know what's going on around him. And he's missing something really important. And so God has to step in through the donkey and help him to see this thing that he is missing, because he needs to take his eye a little bit off where he's going and recognize what's going on where he actually is. Now, as I said, I flew a lot, and it got me kind of really curious when I was flying a lot about planes and flying and being a pilot and what would that look like, and you know, that was it never really occurred to me that that's a career, like people do that, and so I actually subscribed for a while to a couple of airplane and magazines and stuff like that, because that's what I like to do when I get curious about something, to learn about it. So I subscribed to this one. I can't remember which one it was, but I subscribed to this airplane magazine that talked about all the different, it's for private pilots, so small planes, Cessnas, things like that. And it was kind of a magazine for that group. And I enjoyed it, and they talked about new airplanes that had come out, and which ones are the older ones, and different places, interesting places you could fly. And I realized over time that probably wasn't anything I was ever going to do. The amount of time and energy and money you have to invest into getting your pilot's license probably wasn't something I probably ever was going to do. But I was curious about it. I liked reading about it. But this particular magazine had a really interesting, and I thought rather curious section where towards the end they went through and pretty much every issue narrated and talked through some sort of challenge or issue, or in some cases, like disaster that happened for a pilot, and especially a private pilot, and they would basically narrate accidents that were happened, and sometimes these accidents were actually fatal accidents for either the pilot or passengers or people on the ground or something like that. And I always thought, this is a really interesting thing to include in your magazine, right? You're not selling me on it by necessarily by telling me all the bad things that could happen. But really, I kind of figured, maybe they kind of figured that if you were buying a magazine, you were already sort of sold on it. And I grew to actually kind of appreciate that section. And one of the things that I learned a phrase that I learned in that section was the danger of something that was called "get there-itis." Right? And what oftentimes that would get narrated in these things where things go wrong, especially amongst amateur private pilots, things that go wrong is you get to this point where maybe you're 90 minutes, maybe you're 2 hours, into a flight, you're 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes from home, you get this feeling like you're almost there, but in the intervening time, something has changed, right? Maybe you don't have as much fuel as you thought you did, maybe oftentimes the weather has changed. And what you probably ought to do in that moment is turn around and go back, or find an alternate airport, or the situation around you has deteriorated in some way, and you probably need to find a safer thing to do than continue on to where you're going. And there's this thing that kind of creeps in where you're like, but we're almost there. Right? Like if the weather turns, 20 minutes into your 2-hour flight, you're much more likely to turn around and go back. If you're 20 minutes from your destination, I think we can all understand how hard it would be to say, but I'm so close to my goal, or I feel like I'm so close to my goal. Why would I give up now? And they warn you that this idea of get there-itis takes over, where you just kind of talk yourself into taking one more little bit of risk, and one more little bit of risk, and one more little bit of risk, and maybe you get through it, and maybe none of those risks come to fruition, or maybe they do, and maybe it ends not only badly, but maybe it ends really badly. There's actually a technical name for this, and it's called plan continuation bias. We all have biases we walk around with, and one of them is called this idea of plan continuation. Basically, if you're on a path, you're already moving a certain direction, you're already trying to achieve a certain goal, our built-in bias says we need to keep moving towards that goal. Even if along the way we learn that maybe that isn't the right goal for us, or maybe that isn't the place we really want to go, or there's dangers we didn't think about, or there's complications we didn't think about, or there are costs we didn't think about. But this idea of just keep moving just keep moving in the direction that we were planning to go. There's something about us that just wants to continue on the path and continue down the plan that we are already on. Sometimes we need that, right? Sometimes that's an okay thing because it helps us carry us through obstacles that we didn't necessarily foresee. Sometimes that's about having the grit that we need to have to just hunker down and persevere. Sometimes, though, that plan continuation bias, that get there-itis, can betray us and lead us to something or taking risks that we ought not to take. As I was thinking about this, I was recalling a podcast that I had listened to recently. It's a podcast called Cautionary Tales, and it is kind of what it says it is. They go through like historical things that have happened, usually tragic things that have happened, and try to ferret out the lessons that we can learn from them. And in the very first episode, they talk about this oil tanker called the Torrey Canyon, which was a British oil tanker, built in the late 1950s, that served to move oil from Kuwait to refineries in England. And it was a very, very big ship, especially for its time. We have a lot bigger ones now, but at the time it was considered a super carrier. It was a really, really big ship. It carried a lot of oil, and there was only so many places that it could go. Like, there's only so many places that it could dock. And in 1968, it had picked up a load of oil from Kuwait and had made its way all the way around, back to England, and it had a reservation to dock at a specific port. Now, this port, because the ship was so big, the ship could only dock between certain hours, basically when the tide was the highest. And the captain recognized that for a few reasons they had not made quite as good time as they had expected to. The captain had realized that their window to make their slot was coming to an end. And if they didn't make it at the time they were trying to make it, they would actually have to pull up and short in deeper water and wait actually several days before the next time that the water level would be high enough for them to actually go into where it is they were meant to go into. And so the captain kind of felt this pressure, right? Really what he was feeling was get There-Itis, right? We've come all the way from Kuwait. We did all this way. We're not going to stop just a few miles short. And so he decides to take a shortcut. And he takes a shortcut through a place called the Seven Stones. And he takes a shortcut through a piece of water that he really didn't know all that well, nor did they have really detailed charts for. And as you might expect, given how I introduced this, the ship ends up actually running aground as part of this, to the point that it cannot be unstuck from where it is. It's stuck there for a number of days, and over time actually starts to even break apart. And it was until the Exxon Valdez accident, later in the 90s, it was the single biggest oil spill, that had ever happened from a ship. Now, there's actually some video, a newsreel kind of thing from the time that I want to show you real quick. So here, watch this.
The tanker Torrey Canyon struck a reef and gushed oil over the sea, ruining much of the southwest coast of England. The tourist trade and bird life are also affected. These seabirds covered with fuel oil cannot fly, but a bath in a newly developed solution saved many. 9 days after being on the reef, the tanker broke in two, spilling more of her 36 million gallons of oil into the sea, with most of it sweeping onto the sandy shores. In a futile, desperate effort, men hose the beach and surf with detergents. Jet planes from the British Air Force bomb the ship with 42,000-pound high-explosive bombs. Smoke billows up from the hulk of the ship, but despite the barrage of bombs, napalm, and rockets, oil continued to spread over the troubled waters of Britain's coasts. And there's more of the sticky invader still in the tanker's hold.
All right, I don't know if you caught that at the end because it went by rather quick. So at a certain point, the British government realizes they've got this ship full of oil, right? It's already leaked a bunch, and in fact, the oil that it's leaked is spreading all over the place. Some of it's actually going to end up in beaches in France. It's going to do a huge number on the population of puffins along several French beaches. It's going to take decades for them to actually recover from it, and so it is kind of an ecological, disaster in that regard. But the government realizes they've got this ship with still a whole lot more oil on it that they'd really prefer not to see go in the ocean. So they decide, in this way that you could probably only do in like the 1960s to try to blow it up. The first thing they do is they try to drop 1,000-pound bombs on it to set it on fire. They do several things to set it on fire, and then high tide would come and put the fire back out again. At the end of the day, when the ship finally is destroyed and sunk, they dropped 161 bombs on it, 16 rockets, 15,000 tons of napalm, and 10,000 gallons of kerosene. So they have this huge thing of oil, so they drop more oil products on it. I mean, it's just one of those things of like, oh my God, I'm sure whoever thought this up at the time thought this, oh, I've got the cleverest solution for this. Let's just burn it all. And it obviously worked out just about as well as you think it worked out. But this is the problem, right? I mean, this is the problem with this idea of get there-itis. This is the problem of being so focused on your goal that you fail to notice what's happening around you. You fail to notice that there are new risks or new dangers or new opportunities or whatever it is happening around you, that the situation that you thought it was different now than it was. And all of the hardship and all of the pain and all of the fallout that happened from this ship running aground could have been avoided had the captain been a little more patient, paid a little bit more attention, and really sat back and reflected on, what is my goal? Is my goal to get there at this certain time? Or is my goal to get there safely? If the goal is to get there safely, then you don't take a shortcut through waters you don't know and take all that extra risk that really didn't pay off in the end. Because that's the other thing we learn along the way. If we pay attention to what's happening along the way, one of the things we may learn along the way is the goal, the place that we set out to reach in the first place, may not be the place we really need to get to. The goal for anybody involved at the end of the day was first and foremost that the ship arrive safely. Only after that do we worry too much about when it arrives. And given the choice of arriving a little bit late or arriving not at all, anybody who would thought about it would choose to simply arrive a little late. We have to be careful when we get stuck on things, and we need to be careful to examine what our goals really are. Because sometimes we just can get on a version of autopilot where we do the things that we do because it's the way that we do them. We get focused on where we're going and the problems that are in front of us and focus all of that we forget to notice what's happening around us. The church can be guilty of that too. It really is. I mean, this idea is really what is what a lot of what Wesley was trying to reform against. So Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, was founding a reform movement, right? He was starting a movement, not necessarily to start a new church. That was not the goal. But the goal was to say, hey, church, this thing that we are spending all our time on, these places we're spending time on, these goals that we have, are we sure these are the goals that we want to have? Is this really where God is calling us to be? Are we where God is calling us to be, or does God want us to doing something different? And many people didn't welcome Wesley asking those questions because many people had a path they were on. They were comfortable on the path that they were on, and all they really wanted to do was keep going. Balaam was comfortable in the path he was on. He was riding on his donkey, heading to where he knew he was going to, was not expecting nor wanting any interruptions on that path, and then God showed up and something different happened. Balaam has get there-itis. The church in Wesley's day had the same thing. They were focused on what they were doing and what they expected to be doing and really couldn't see that God was actually giving them new things to do and asking them to take on new goals. The pilot, the captain of the ship, faced that same problem. He didn't quite recognize what his goals really needed to be. So as we take our road trip this summer, and anytime we get the opportunity to take our road trips wherever they may be, yes, it's good to go places. It is good to be places. It is good to have goals. It is good to achieve. It is good to have things we want to do and to accomplish. But let's not forget that while we're on the path, while we're heading down the road, while we're doing the things that we do to accomplish our goals in life and the things we think we want to be about and do, God continues to be with us. God continues to talk to us. God continues to shape us. God continues to lead us. And sometimes what God tries to do is help us understand that that place we are trying to get to may not be the best place for us after all. Let us have hearts and minds open when we are walking down the road, thinking we know where we're going, that at the end of the day, God knows best where it is that we need to be. So while we are achieving and working hard, and yes, we should do those things, let us also have hearts and minds open to God's continual presence and the continual leading of the Spirit, because we never know when things might change. We never know when a new opportunity might come up. We never know when God may have somewhere else He needs and wants and is calling us to be. Let us be open to that and enjoy the trip along the way. Amen.